As we look at week 6, we're going to take some of the symbolic frame and we're going to break it down into organizational culture. And as I mentioned last week, this whole symbolic frame is a very critical frame for us to understand. And the organizational culture, or that collective beliefs and values, is critical to understanding that symbolic frame. Organizational culture is, again, as I said earlier, very difficult to understand, but once grasped and understood, it's a very powerful tool that you can put into your administrative tool bag. It's important, I believe, as we look at some of the articles this week, that you understand that these types of articles are critical to understand as you move forward as a leader. The pieces that I've asked you to look at this week were instrumental in my understanding of organizational culture. I want to draw your attention primarily to the text by Joanne Martin, the introduction and overview and pieces of the puzzle. I think that's a foundational work that is important for you to understand. It was in some ways the framework in which I used to understand organizational culture in my dissertation. I used Joanne Martin's work extensively as I began to unpack the organizational culture within my particular context. And I think it's important for the young administrator, the young leader within the context of the private sector to understand this. And I would say that every organization has a culture, but oftentimes the symbolic nature and the in-depth nature of the organizational culture is intensified by this small private school, in part because it is so ingrained in the individuals. And oftentimes, what you'll find in organizations is you'll find an iconic leader, someone who has been bestowed as the father or the mother of an organization. And he or she will be the collective wisdom in some ways of the tribe. And so we often talk about the corporate culture, talk about the educational culture, and we also can understand the tribal culture that exists within organizations. And these tribes that exist within the organization will often be described as a tribal leader. That leader has a clear understanding of the culture, the values, and the belief systems within that culture. And sometimes we'll say that these cultures will exist and subcultures will exist within an organization. And it's important to understand not only the overall arching culture, but to understand the subcultures, and you'll have leaders within those subcultures. Again, this is a very complex and very difficult thing to understand, but is well worth your time to unpack it your organization. As I talk, I'm sure that you can all understand that you can experience your culture, you've lived in your culture, but have you really studied your culture? I would recommend that you spend some time trying to understand the context in which you're living and which you're operating in today, and I think you will have an enriched practice as a result.